All right, so I just wanted to take a little bit of time to try drawing out a system and thinking through visually kind of how I want some piece of my system to interact. So I'm going to be using Microsoft Paint because I don't really have anything else that's great for this. So this is going to be a little bit brutal because drawing in Paint is pretty garbage, but um, hopefully I can get this presented here. Yeah, so just double checking that I can see my MS Paint on the stream. Okay, so what I'm trying to do is for quite some time as a hobby project, I like building a, a back end system to a role playing game. And it's been something that I like to use for, testing out different, uh, things I'm learning in programming, whether it's dependency injection, different patterns I like to use, things like that. Just a cool way for me to practice in a territory that I feel like I enjoy a lot. I love playing role playing games. So being able to create something is really enjoyable for me. So the, the sort of challenge I'm working through right now is that I have these different pieces of my system that I'm putting together, and I've created something for generating loot, which is sort of working in isolation. I'm pretty happy with how that's coming together, and part of what I'm trying to do now is test out that certain expected behavior can be exercised. So as funny as it sounds, I'm writing this backend for a role playing game, but there's not much of a UI. I'm actually trying to prove out functions with tests, and I'm at the point now where I would like to prove out that my systems interact properly together. And I haven't actually figured out the solution to this, so I thought it'd be kind of cool to walk through and and see like if I can come up with something, or if I get stuck, that's cool too. I'm not sure if I'm going to come up with a perfect solution, but um, I'm going to try drawing out some pieces of my system here and explaining what's going on, and then seeing what we can kind of come up with here. So to start, I have, oops, I'd rather not use red. So I have this system. Um, Actually, I'm going to stop using the word system because that's going to mean something else in a second. So I have this domain, let's call it, and it has a class. It's called a loot generator. Whether or not the actual class is called that, there's this thing that does loot generation, and part of what's involved with that is that I have this nice little domain separation where anything that you're trying to call into the loot generator, you have to kind of speak the language of the loot generator. And the reason I've done this is to keep all of the information and all the classes and all the interaction that are responsible for loot generation in their own little domain. I don't want these things leaking through into other parts of my system design. So in order to generate loot, you have to be able to give it parameters that the loot generator understands. The reason I like doing this is so that my loot generator doesn't have to understand the calling systems and try to interpret what they're trying to say. It's up to the calling systems to speak the language of the loot generator. And I like doing this a lot with my different domains that I'm working with. I find that if you put a little translation layer in front of a system you're trying to call, or sorry, calling into a domain, then it keeps your code a lot cleaner. So what I have kind of coming into here is I have this. I have something called a generation context, and so it is we call it a DTO, a data transfer object, because it has some state, it has some information, and all that it's responsible for is bundling up a whole bunch of context regarding the loot you want to generate, and passing it into this system. So that goes. I'm going to use this to draw an arrow. It's brutal. That's an arrow though. Cool. So you pass in this generation context, and I have all this code that I've been working on that does a whole bunch of magic that takes this generation context and takes information off of it. Um, so this little bubble here that does magic, and what it does is it passes back out what you might expect if you're generating loot. Um, it passes out items. So it's cool because you're calling into this interface. You translate whatever information you're dealing with into this generation context, again, so that you can speak the language of the loot generator. I have all this code behind the scenes that I've been working on that's working how I would like, that does some sort of magic to spit back out items. So just for some more context, what this magic that I'm referring to might do, it might be that it's based on the conditions of the context. So something you might see on the context is information about the player's level. So if you were a level 1 player and we needed to generate loot for you, you will probably see in a particular game, you would probably see worse loot at level 1 than you might see at, say, the level cap of 100 or something. If you're level 100, you probably should be getting better loot. So information like that's passed along the context into this generator. It does whatever it needs to do. Part of it might be reading up item definitions, reading up ranges that it can generate, different values for creating these items, like a single item, multiple items, whatever it needs to do based on the context, and then spit back out items. So the nice thing is that whoever's calling this doesn't have to know anything about what's happening where I've written the word magic. So I'm really happy with how that's working. This domain's coming along nicely. I've started writing tests on this domain. Feels good. But now I have this weird situation where I'm going, I want to write some tests, some functional tests for my game engine that can actually explain some sort of features that I would like to have in the game and how they interact with loot generation. And this is where I started to get a little bit lost with how I'm going to connect the dots here. So if I go to the other end of my system design, I have this concept of a game engine. So I'm going to draw a little block here. When I'm talking about game engine here, I'm not even talking about like the rendering and all that kind of stuff. I'm literally just talking about the systems in the back end that I want interacting with each other. So I have this concept that I've been working on where I like making plugin systems. So essentially how this would work is that I can create a system that gets registered into this engine as a plugin, and the engine is capable of handling, n number of systems. So I'm going to draw out a couple things here. We're going to have system 1. We're going to have system 2. An example of a system we might have is a weather system. So part of what I like to do in this engine that I've been building, when I try making front ends for it, I like playing around with the fact that I can have a character walking around and all of a sudden it starts raining. I'm not really good at making it look like rain, but I can make systems that handle a transition between different types of weather. Another thing you might see is time of day, which I think is a cool idea for a system where you see it in a lot of role-playing games where it gets darker at night, other effects start happening, kind of thing. But we can keep building out these systems, right? So up to n number of systems, like I was mentioning. And these all get registered in to the engine. This is a really bad way to represent this, but I'm just kind of trying to indicate that these are all they get registered into the engine. Now, the engine has sort of a main loop, and if you read about game design and stuff, there's usually this main loop that people talk about where it's like you're reading user input, you're rendering things, whatever, like you're processing game logic. When I'm talking about my main loop, it's really just about processing for these systems. And the way that works is, so I'm going to write main loop, and the things that I do inside the main loop are, I ask each system for their own context information. So not every system has to do this, but I'll explain what it is and what I mean by that. So I mentioned I have a weather system and a time of day system. Cool. What they're able to do is when the engine asks in its main loop, each system, provide me context if you'd like. something like the weather system can say, great, please put on your context this information. I'm providing you information about the weather, right? It's responsible for creating weather. And similarly, the time of day system can say, I would like to register, this information about time of day to this context that can be shared out. Another example of a system that I've been experimenting with just to kind of prove it out is sort of like a stat display system. And all that it's responsible for in its current little prototype is just calculating stats. And I was using it for a bit of a debug type of thing where I could go calculate these stats out, print them out somewhere. But the interesting thing was this system didn't provide anything back to the main context. So this first part of the loop, when the engine reached, say, system 2, I'm pointing at my screen. I realize you can't see that I'm pointing at my screen. So if we pretend that system 2 is my stat printing system, when the main loop came across system 2 and was like, hey, do you have anything you want to provide to the context? It would just say, nope, like I'm good. But it would reach the weather system. The weather system would say, yeah, like here's the weather I want to provide onto the context. And the time of day system would say, yeah, like by the way, here's the time of day, put this onto the context. So the main loop I have starts by asking each system which the context that it would like to provide. The next part of what this main loop does, I'm just pulling it up to double check so I don't say the wrong thing here. The next part of what the main loop does is, it ends up, so it grabs the context information for each context from these systems, and then it actually will say for each of the systems, go process with, right? So it actually does it goes through 2 end times, one to ask each system to provide information for the context, and the next iteration through is actually to say, okay, go process with this full context. So it gives every system an opportunity to provide information to the other systems. So that's how this sort of main loop works in my game engine. And I think one of the interesting things I'm trying to figure out is like, I have what ends up getting made from all of these. I'm going to try to get this. So, this system here, I set a time of day system. So these end up creating, my drawings are horrible, but these end up creating a context, right? I said they provide information to the how do I want to say this? This is the engine's context, right? They provide information to the engine's context, which is great. Cool. Now, what I'm struggling with, and I haven't wrapped my head around it, is this engine context has information about everything that's interesting in the game. And I want to be able to generate loot using information from this context, which means I need some way to go from here all the way to here, right? That's a way better way to draw arrows, way better than these ones over here. Okay, so I need a way to take this context and go from the engine context to the generation context. Now, for me to write the conversion logic, I'm not too worried about that. I think that I have a good way of I have components in my systems where I can translate them between the 2 things that are necessary. So that's great. It's less about how to translate and more about when and how. And what I mean by that is the loot generator itself is not a system that plugs into the engine. The loot generator is a sort of an API I have that you give it a context and it gives you back items. But when does that need to happen, right? That's sort of what I'm trying to wrap my head around. So I was thinking about this before I started recording. And the things that kind of come to mind were, like a quest reward. So you finish a quest, some sort of trigger happens and it's like, hey, go generate loot, which means that whatever, I haven't built it yet, but whenever a quest is finishing, there is a mechanism where we would need to try and grab the information. We need access to the engine's context to say, give me the current state of the engine's context. I'm going to translate it. I'm going to give it to the loot generator. So another thing would be like opening a chest, right? So, and think about role-playing games, and you come across some sort of chest or container, and you open it up, and you get all this glorious loot. But when that happens, when that action occurs, again, I need to be able to access the engine's context, translate it into a generation context, and get the items back out. Another thing might be combat, right? So you kill the skeleton, and the skeleton drops, a stack of gold, and it drops the coolest armor in the game. But that required, again, I needed access to the engine's context to get converted. What I started to realize was that some of these feel like they're the result of a user interaction. And another thing I thought of was maybe there's like, I don't know, like if I have scripting in the game. If there's some sort of scripted game event, that might not actually be because of a user interaction, right? So where I'm trying to get at with this is like, I need a way, like these other systems I've defined, they get provided the engine's context during a loop, right? It's technically not a global context because it gets passed into their update function. So while yes, there is only one engine, it's not globally accessible by everyone. You have to be a registered system to get the engine's context, which means that the first thing that came to mind was like, for all these things that I wrote, in order to get an engine's context, do they need to be their own system? Like, right? Do I have a combat system? I probably will. That would probably make sense. But do I have a combat system that is able to get the engine's context? And because it has that, then it can handle loot generation. Maybe that one might be handled that way. When you open a chest, what's that, right? Like, do I need to have is there some sort of like game object interaction system that when you walk up to a chest and you press the open button, that it does the loot generation, right? Maybe that works because it would be a system that gets fed this engine's context. Is there a quest system? Now, the reason I'm like, what might not be apparent is that when I keep saying a system, it's that the idea of a system in my game design is that it keeps getting called by an update function, right? So for it to be a system, it suggests that it should be constantly fed these updates with new context. Now, a script system might make sense, right? Where I can register a bunch of scripts to go run and they keep getting updated so they get new states. So that one might make a lot of sense as a system. But something like, I don't know, a quest system, I don't know if it makes sense. Or maybe there needs to be some sort of triggering system, right? Where the way that might work is that when you kill someone in combat, or you open a chest, or you finish a quest, maybe those actions can actually publish something to a system, right? And then that system could be responsible for saying, okay, how do I handle a combat action of like someone's been killed, or how do I handle an action where a chest has been opened, and it can process them and take on it can leverage the engine's context has been provided. So that's currently what I'm trying to wrap my head around, is like, I need a way to go from this guy, engine's context, all the way down to here to get this generation context. And I'm trying to come up with ways to do that. So the one thing that I've been thinking about, and it seems kind of weird, but I think it would be kind of neat. And I think the flexibility of what I'm about to explain could be applied to many things, right? So I thought because I haven't really seen this happen in a role playing game, and probably because it would be kind of weird and ridiculous, but why not? What if when you're generating loot, you could actually take into account what the weather's like or the time of day, right? So I wrote these two systems here in particular because I think they could create some sort of interesting game scenarios where, as an example, you're in some special spot in the game and you need to. I'm kind of thinking back to like some hidden Easter eggs, maybe like in Pokemon where you were trying to like, it's not really an Easter egg, but you had to like, the only way you could evolve a Pokemon was meeting some sort of conditions or whatever. And that got me thinking, like, what if you're in this game and you need to go to a particular map and you need to wait for a certain time of day and you need to wait for it to snow. Then, while it's snowing at night, as an example, you can try to farm some particular type of loot. To me, that's a whole other dynamic that you can introduce to a game that I don't really see. I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but like, I mean, why not? Why not be able to have that flexibility where you can design really complex loot systems? I'm not saying that that's going to make it easy to balance or have any. I don't know, like maybe that kind of functionality would never make it into the game because it's totally ridiculous. But why not? I get really interested in trying to make these systems that can do things. So if it's not weather or time of day, maybe there's another type of system that you know um, can feed into this. So another thing, as a general statement, like I have this notion of well, it's a role playing game, so there's going to be stats, right? So your character can have all sorts of different stats. So a way, like a totally off the wall idea might be that based on your stats you could generate. Actually, it's not really that off the wall for the base case, but based on a player's stats, like their level, which is a stat, um, based on their level, you would go generate loot. Okay, so level's a basic stat, but what if you said like, this one's a little weird. Like, what if you said that you could find different loot if you were at 50% health? I don't know why you would ever do that, but but why not be able to have the flexibility to build something like that? What if you had, I don't know, something like um, diseases in the game, or you had shape shifting in the game? You could check these stats of the player and you could say like, hey, because you're in werewolf form or because you're a vampire, whatever. I mean, I haven't built the game, I'm just talking about the system um, and the mechanics behind it. But like, what if you could say based on these states that you can generate different types of loot? So that's the part that really interests me. But I think ultimately it comes down to like to this, right? Like, how do I take that engine context that has state from all of these systems and then translate it into this generation context down here so that we can get the loot? So again, I haven't figured out the answer. Even talking through this, I'm not totally sure what I want to do, but I think a good first step would be making sure that I'm just gonna write it here is like uh, make sure we can convert the engine context to a generation context. That's paramount. If I don't think that should be an issue, but I can write code to do it, because if we can't even do that, this kind of falls apart. And then maybe it's worth exploring, like I don't know, maybe a really naive way to do this, and I don't like this, but maybe it's a way to start. Is like, maybe I have a system that's just um, a provider. And what I mean by that is, what if I could register a system that it doesn't actually put other stuff on the context, but when it's told to update, all that it does is it updates a reference to the context, and that provider can actually let other people access it. That might be a really gross way to start, but that might actually let me start building some of these pieces, and then conceptually, if they make sense to pull into their own services, then the fewer things that rely on this provider service, the fewer things that rely on it, I can start scoping them out and translating them into systems of their own. That might be a way to get started, right? Because ultimately, what I want to do in a test I want to write is actually prove out that I can do something with weather to change item generation. So, as an example, I could make what I call a drop table or a loot table, and say, like, when you have weather condition snow, as an example, you drop this type of loot. Otherwise, you drop this other type of loot. And what I would like to do is make a functional test where I have a weather system and I can change the weather to, say, snow or to rain, and prove that I generate the right type of loot based on that. So just tying all these pieces together. The cool thing about having a test like this is that what I'm trying to do with this functional test is prove that my whole framework can support this. If I start with the provider service that links these together, where someone can read off the provider, hey, give me the latest engines context. If I can prove it with that to start, if I need to migrate away from that later, at least I have this test that proves these pieces have to work together. So that's sort of my thought process. Right now, if I can't come up with the perfect solution for getting this all wired up together, that's okay. I don't expect it to be perfect. I don't even know what I'm building yet. So I would kind of like to get something going, put the tests in place that prove I have this expected functionality, because ultimately that's what it comes down to. If it works, then it works. And then from there, as I'm building out more pieces and finding more patterns, that's where I can start to say, okay, it worked and it's not scaling well. It's not extensible. Let's go back to the drawing board. And I have that luxury of doing it because I have these functional tests that prove I have this expected behavior. So that's kind of what I've come up with. That's where this is just a little hobby project I like dabbling in. And I thought it'd be kind of cool to spend some time on it. Make a little video to talk about how some pieces interact. I've been looking a lot at distributed systems and drawing distributed system diagrams. So this was a nice little change to actually focus on not distributed systems with things in the cloud and different services, but rather something more central to a single application. So hopefully that was a little bit interesting, not too boring, but that's sort of a thought process for kind of what I'm doing when I'm trying to think about how to link some pieces together.